The Imperial Palace on Zenthar Prime stretched across 3 mountain ranges, its crystalline spires catching the light of twin suns. Emperor Vexthor stood in the Hall of Forgotten Wonders, his 6 eyes fixed on the massive spacecraft suspended in stasis fields. The celestial unicorn hung there like a monument to failure, its hull covered in dust that had accumulated over 3,000 standard years. "Your Majesty, the human has arrived," announced Chamberlain Krelix, his mandibles clicking nervously. Vexthor's scales rippled with annoyance. A human, the youngest species in the Galactic Council, barely 2 centuries into space travel. They had no business in his palace, let alone near the unicorn. But the Council had been insistent. Every master engineer in the known galaxy had failed to revive the ancient vessel. Perhaps they suggested fresh eyes might see what centuries of expertise had missed. "Send them in," Vexthor commanded, his voice resonating through the cavernous hall. The doors opened, and in walked the most unremarkable creature Vexthor had ever seen. The human was small, wearing stained coveralls and carrying a battered toolbox that looked older than their entire civilization. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot, and she had some kind of dark smudge on her cheek. "Sarah Chen, Your Majesty," she said, bowing awkwardly. "I'm here about the ship." Vexthor descended the steps slowly, his robes trailing behind him. "Do you understand what you are looking at, human? This is the celestial unicorn, built by the precursors 10,000 years before your ancestors discovered fire. It has defeated every engineer, every technician, every master craftsman in the galaxy." Sarah tilted her head, studying the ship with an intensity that surprised him. "Why is it called the unicorn?" "Because it is a myth made real," Vexthor replied. "A ship that could fold space without gates, that could communicate across galaxies instantly, that could repair itself using only starlight. The legends say whoever masters the unicorn will unite the stars. And you've been trying to fix it for how long?" Vexthor's scales darkened. 3,000 years. Since my ancestor, the first emperor, discovered it drifting in dead space. Sarah whistled low. "That's a long time to work on one problem." She walked closer to the ship, her boots echoing on the marble floor. "Mind if I take a look?" The emperor's advisors chittered and clicked disapprovingly, but Vexthor raised a hand for silence. He was curious despite himself. The human showed no fear, no reverence. She looked at the celestial unicorn like it was simply a machine that needed fixing. "The stasis fields?" Sarah asked. "They will not interfere," Vexthor assured her. Sarah opened her toolbox and pulled out a device that looked primitive compared to Zenthari technology. She scanned the hull, frowning at the readings. Then she did something that made everyone in the hall gasp. She touched the ship with her bare hand. "Don't," Krelix shouted. "The hull is charged with precursor energy. It will—" Nothing happened. Sarah's hand remained pressed against the metal and she closed her eyes as if listening to something. "Interesting," she murmured. "It's not dead. It's sleeping." Vexthor moved closer, his interest piqued. "Impossible. We have scanned every millimeter. The power core is completely inert." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him. "Your Majesty, can I ask you something?" "Why do you want to fix this ship?" The question caught him off guard. "To restore the glory of the precursors. To unlock their secrets. To prove that the Zenthari Empire is worthy of their legacy." "Right," Sarah said slowly. "That's what I thought." She walked around the ship, her hand still trailing along the hull. Every engineer who came here probably thought the same thing. This ship is a prize to be won, a puzzle to be solved, a treasure to possess. Is it not? Vexthor demanded. Sarah stopped and looked up at the massive vessel. "Maybe that's the problem. You've been treating it like a thing instead of treating it like what it really is." "And what is it really, human?" Vexthor's voice carried a warning edge. "She's alive," Sarah said simply. "Not like you or me, but alive in her own way. The precursors didn't build machines. They grew them. This ship has been waiting for 3,000 years for someone to ask what she needs instead of demanding what they want." The hall erupted in argument. The advisors declared the human insane. The scholars insisted the precursors were merely advanced engineers. But Vexthor raised his hand for silence again. He had spent his entire reign studying the unicorn. He had devoted resources that could have fed entire planets. He had obsessed over this ship since he was a hatchling following his father through these very halls. And in all that time, in all those years, no one had ever suggested they were approaching the problem wrong. "Explain," Vexthor commanded. Sarah set down her toolbox and pulled out a worn tablet. I studied everything your people sent about the unicorn. All the scans, all the tests, all the failed attempts to activate her. And I noticed something. Every time someone tried to force the systems online, the ship's energy signatures would spike and then drop even lower than before. Like she was defending herself. She pulled up holographic displays showing centuries of data. Look at the pattern. It's not random degradation. It's deliberate withdrawal. The more aggressively you pushed, the deeper she retreated into dormancy. Vexthor stared at the data he had seen 1,000 times before, seeing it now through different eyes. Could it be possible? Had they been fighting against the very ship they sought to restore? You said she is sleeping, Vexthor said carefully. How do we wake her? Sarah smiled, and it was neither arrogant nor servile. It was the smile of someone who genuinely loved their work. Well, Your Majesty, when something's been asleep for 3,000 years, you don't wake it up by shouting at it. You start gentle. You let it know it's safe. You show it that you're a friend, not a threat. She picked up her toolbox again. With your permission, I'd like to spend some time with her. Alone, if possible. No sensors, no recorders, no observers. Just me and the unicorn getting to know each other. Every instinct Vexthor had screamed against this. Leave this priceless artifact alone with a human? A species barely evolved from primitive tool users? But something else whispered in the back of his mind. A voice that sounded like his father, who had also stood in this hall and wondered if perhaps they had been wrong all along. 3 days, Vexthor decided. You will have 3 days alone with the unicorn. If you fail, you will leave and never return. If you succeed, and he paused, considering the implications. If you succeed, Saracen, you will have earned the gratitude of the Zenthari Empire. Sarah nodded. That's fair. I'll need my camping gear brought in. And coffee. Lots of coffee. As the preparations were made and the hall slowly emptied, Vexthor took one last look at the human standing before the great ship. She seemed so small, so insignificant compared to the massive vessel. Yet something about the way she looked at it, with respect rather than greed, with curiosity rather than conquest, gave him a strange feeling he had not experienced in centuries. Hope. The hall was silent now except for the soft hum of the stasis fields. Sarah had set up her sleeping bag near the base of the celestial unicorn and arranged her tools in a careful semicircle. The palace staff had brought her requested supplies and then retreated, leaving her alone with 10,000 years of history suspended above her. She made herself a cup of coffee using a portable heater and sat cross-legged on the floor just looking at the ship. Not scanning it, not analyzing it, just looking. In the dim light of the hall, the unicorn's hull seemed to shimmer with colors that shouldn't exist, shifting between silver and gold and something that her brain couldn't quite process. Hey there, Sarah said softly to the ship. I'm Sarah, I fix things. Well, mostly I fix things. Sometimes I make them worse, but I try my best. She took a sip of coffee, aware of how ridiculous she must look talking to a spaceship, but she'd learned long ago that the best mechanics weren't the ones with the most knowledge. They were the ones who understood that every machine had a personality, a mood, a way of working that was uniquely its own. I bet you've seen a lot of people come through here, she continued, all of them probably very important, very smart, all of them wanting something from you. She paused. I'm not going to lie and say I don't want anything, but what I want is just to understand you, to see how you work, to appreciate whoever created something as beautiful as you. The ship remained still and silent. Sarah finished her coffee and stood up. She walked slowly around the unicorn's perimeter, not touching, just observing. The hull was seamless in places, but in others she could see patterns that looked almost organic, like veins or roots spreading across metal that wasn't quite metal. The Emperor said you could fold space without gates, she mused. That must have been incredible. Can you imagine? Jumping across the galaxy in an instant, no infrastructure needed. You'd be completely free. She stopped and looked up at the ship's underside. Is that why you shut down? Because after the precursors were gone, whoever found you tried to lock you up? Tried to own you? Her tablet beeped softly. She'd set it to monitor the ship's energy signatures passively, not actively scanning. The readings showed nothing had changed. The unicorn was still as dormant as it had been for 3 millennia. Sarah set up her camping chair and pulled out a sandwich. As she ate, she started talking again, telling the ship about Earth, about the first time humans had managed to break light speed, About the terror and wonder of discovering they weren't alone in the universe. About the colony on Mars where she'd grown up, watching ships come and go, dreaming of the stars. My dad was a mechanic too, she said. Worked on cargo haulers mostly. Nothing fancy. But he taught me that every machine tells a story if you know how to listen. He said that the best engineers don't impose their will on machines. They collaborate with them. Hours passed. Sarah told stories, drank coffee, and occasionally made notes on her tablet. She talked about her training, about the ships she'd fixed, about the time she'd accidentally vented an entire fuel line and nearly got herself killed. I was 19 and thought I knew everything, she laughed. The ship's computer tried to warn me, but I ignored it. Thought I was smarter than some old system. Learned my lesson pretty quick when alarms started screaming and I had about 30 seconds to get out before the whole section depressurized. She stood and walked to the ship again, placing her hand on the hull. The thing is, I survived because the computer didn't give up on me. Even though I'd ignored its warnings, it still guided me to the nearest airlock. Still tried to save the stupid kid who thought she knew better. This time, something was different. The metal under her palm felt warm. Not hot, but warm like something living. Sarah held her breath, not daring to move. "Are you there?" she whispered. Her tablet chimed urgently. The energy readings were changing, rising from the baseline for the first time in recorded history. Sarah's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was like approaching a wild animal. Any sudden movement, any sign of aggression, and it would retreat. "It's okay," she said soothingly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to try to control you. I just want to talk." The warmth under her hand spread, moving across the hull like a wave. Colors rippled across the surface, those impossible colors that seemed to exist between the normal spectrum. And then Sarah heard something. Not with her ears, but in her mind. A presence vast and old and curious. It wasn't words. It was more like feelings, impressions. Loneliness, confusion, pain, and underneath it all a question. "Who am I?" Sarah answered the unspoken question. "I'm nobody important. Just a mechanic from a young species who thinks maybe you've been alone long enough." Another wave of emotion washed over her. Suspicion. The unicorn had been hurt before, used before. Why should this creature be any different? Sarah thought carefully about her answer. She could feel the ship in her mind now, a presence that was both alien and strangely familiar. "Because I'm not asking you to work for me. I'm asking if you want a friend." The presence in her mind shifted, considering. Sarah could feel it probing her memories, her emotions. It was looking at her life, her experiences. She didn't resist. Let the ship see who she really was. It saw her as a child, taking apart her first radio to understand how it worked. It saw her crying when her father died, leaving her alone with his tools and his wisdom. It saw her working double shifts to pay for engineering school. It saw her first day on an alien station, overwhelmed by species and technology she'd only read about. It saw her passion for her work, her love for machines, her respect for the engineers and builders who came before, and it saw that she was telling the truth. She didn't want to own the unicorn. She wanted to understand it. The warmth under Sarah's hand intensified, and suddenly the entire ship was glowing. The stasis fields flickered and died, no longer needed. The celestial unicorn was waking up. In his private chambers, Emperor Vexthor's emergency communicator activated. He listened to the frantic report from the monitoring station and felt his heart beat faster. The human had done something in less than 12 hours that his people couldn't accomplish in 3,000 years. He rushed to the Hall of Forgotten Wonders, his guards struggling to keep pace. When he burst through the doors, he stopped dead in his tracks. The unicorn was floating free of its restraints, hovering in midair. Its hull pulsed with light, and strange symbols were appearing and disappearing across its surface. And standing below it, looking up with tears streaming down her face, was Sarah Chen. "What have you done?" Vexthor breathed. Sarah turned to him, and her expression was one of pure joy. "Your Majesty, I'd like you to meet someone. She doesn't have a name that translates into any language we know, but she's been waiting a very long time to say hello." The unicorn descended slowly until it hovered at eye level with the Emperor. Vexthor felt something brush against his mind, and he gasped. In all his years, in all his studies, he had never imagined this. The ship was not just alive. She was aware, and she was magnificent. News of the celestial unicorn's awakening spread through the palace like wildfire, and then across the planetary network within hours. By morning, representatives from every major civilization in the Galactic Council were demanding access to Zenthar Prime. The ship that had been a curiosity, a museum piece, a failed obsession, was now suddenly the most important object in known space. Emperor Vexthor stood in his strategy room, surrounded by holograms of angry ambassadors and excited scientists. Everyone wanted something. The Krill Collective demanded the ship be turned over to neutral researchers. The Silicon Concordat insisted their digital minds could interface with it better than any organic. The Hive Worlds claimed ancient treaties gave them rights to precursor technology. Silence. Vexthor's voice cut through the chaos. The celestial unicorn awakened on Zenthari soil in the Zenthari Imperial Palace. She will remain under Zenthari protection. She? Ambassador Threx of the Krill raised his eye stalks. You speak of it as though it were alive. Because she is, Vexthor replied firmly. And she has made her preferences clear. She will speak only with Sarah Chen. This caused another eruption of protest. A human, the youngest species in the council, barely more than children playing with technology they barely understood? It was unthinkable. While the ambassadors argued, Sarah sat in the Hall of Forgotten Wonders, which was no longer forgotten and no longer quiet. The unicorn hovered nearby, her hull shifting through colors that Sarah was beginning to recognize as moods. Right now she was showing deep blues and purples, which Sarah had learned meant she was thinking deeply. They all want something from you, Sarah said quietly. I'm sorry about that. A feeling of amusement touched her mind. The unicorn had spent 10,000 years being poked and prodded. A few more petitioners wouldn't make much difference. But there was also a sense of determination. She had chosen Sarah and she would not be swayed. Can you tell me about the precursors? Sarah asked. Everyone says they built you, but you keep showing me images that suggest otherwise. The unicorn's hull rippled, and suddenly Sarah's mind was filled with visions. She saw a civilization that didn't build machines but grew them. The precursors had discovered how to blend technology with living systems, creating ships that were as much biological as mechanical. They were explorers, dreamers, philosophers who saw the universe as something to understand rather than conquer. The unicorn showed her memories of flying through nebulae, of worlds so strange that Sarah's human mind struggled to process them. She saw the precursors, tall and graceful beings made of what looked like living light, working in harmony with their ships. They didn't command. They collaborated, then the visions darkened. Sarah saw war, though not like any war humans had ever fought. This was a war of ideologies, of philosophies. Some precursors wanted to share their gifts with younger species. Others believed those species weren't ready, that they would misuse the technology. The conflict tore their civilization apart. The unicorn showed Sarah her last flight with her precursor partner. A desperate journey to hide the ship's technology, to keep it safe until someone worthy could be found. The precursors' final moments, transferring the last of their consciousness into the ship itself, making the unicorn the keeper of their legacy, and then 3,000 years of silence. Of being found, probed, dissected by species that saw her as a tool rather than a being. Of shutting down completely to protect herself and the secrets she carried. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. You've been so lonely. A wave of acknowledgement washed through her mind, but also relief. Finally, someone understood. Chamberlain Krelix entered the hall nervously. Miss Chen, the Emperor requests your presence in the strategy room. The council is demanding answers. Sarah stood up, feeling the weight of what was coming. They're going to want you to do things, aren't they? Demonstrate your capabilities. Show them how you work. The unicorn pulsed red, a color Sarah had learned meant displeasure. Yeah, I figured. Sarah sighed. Come on, let's face the music together. When Sarah entered the strategy room with the unicorn floating behind her, every conversation stopped. The massive ship somehow managed to fit through the doorway, though Sarah suspected she was doing something with spatial dimensions that shouldn't be possible. Emperor Vexthor gestured to a spot beside him. Sarah Chen, the council has questions. Ambassador Threx spoke first. Human, we demand to know how you achieved what thousands of experts could not. What is your secret? Sarah looked at the assembled representatives. Dozens of species from across the galaxy, all of them more advanced than humanity, all of them staring at her with mixtures of curiosity, envy, and suspicion. I talked to her, Sarah said simply. I listened. I didn't try to command or control. I treated her like a person, not a machine. The Silicon Concordate's representative, a crystalline being named Unit 7, spoke through synthesized tones. Impossible. We have analyzed the vessel extensively. It is technology. Sophisticated beyond measure, but technology nonetheless. The unicorn suddenly surged forward, stopping inches from Unit 7. Colors flashed across her hull rapidly, and the crystalline being stumbled backward. She says you're wrong, Sarah translated, feeling the unicorn's emotions. She's not technology given life. She's life given technological form. There's a difference. A Hive World representative speaking with the collective voice of millions buzzed angrily. This is unacceptable. The Precursor's legacy belongs to all species, not to one human mechanic and a Zenthari emperor. Vexthor's scales darkened. The Precursor's legacy belongs to the Precursors. And they chose to entrust it to this ship, who has now chosen her own path. And what path is that? Demanded a reptilian ambassador from the Saurian hegemony. All eyes turned to Sarah, who suddenly felt very small and very young. She looked at the unicorn, feeling the ship's presence in her mind. She wants to finish what her Precursor partner started, Sarah said slowly. She wants to share the Precursor's knowledge, but not the way everyone here is thinking. Not by being dissected and copied. She wants to teach. Teach? Vexthor leaned forward. Teach what? Sarah closed her eyes, letting the unicorn share her full vision. When she opened them again, she spoke with certainty. The Precursor's greatest discovery wasn't faster than light travel or reality manipulation or any of their technologies. It was understanding that advancement isn't about dominating the universe. It's about harmony with it. Philosophy, Unit 7 said dismissively. We need practical applications. No, Sarah countered, her voice growing stronger. You need to understand why the Precursors disappeared. They had all the power you're craving, and it destroyed them because they forgot that power without wisdom is just destruction with extra steps. The room erupted in argument again. Some representatives were intrigued, others insulted. Still others frustrated that there wasn't going to be an easy shortcut to Precursor technology. Through it all, the unicorn hovered calmly, her hull showing steady greens and golds. She had waited 10,000 years. She could wait a bit longer for these children to understand. Emperor Vexthor raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of his long reign. The Galactic Council will reconvene in 3 days. Until then, I suggest you all consider carefully what you truly want from the Precursor's legacy. Power or wisdom? Because I suspect we can only have one. As the ambassadors logged off and the room emptied, Vexthor turned to Sarah. Did I do the right thing? Sarah looked at the Emperor, seeing him clearly for the first time not as a ruler but as someone who had carried the weight of this mystery his entire life. You gave them time to think. That's more than most leaders would do. The unicorn chimed softly, a sound like distant bells, and both Sarah and Vexthor felt a wave of approval wash through their minds. She likes you, Sarah said, smiling. She thinks you might actually understand. Vexthor looked at the ship that had haunted his family for generations, and for the first time, he saw not a prize to be won, but a teacher to learn from. The question was whether he and his fellow council members were ready to be students. The 3 days before the council reconvened were the strangest of Sarah's life. She'd gone from being an unknown mechanic to someone whose every word was analyzed by millions across the galaxy. News networks ran constant coverage. Scientists published papers speculating on her methods. Some called her a genius. Others called her a fraud. A few religious groups had started worshipping her as a prophet. Sarah ignored it all. She spent her time with the unicorn, learning and sharing. The ship was slowly teaching her things that no human had ever known, but not in the way Sarah had expected. The unicorn didn't download information into her brain or show her blueprints. Instead, she shared experiences, memories, perspectives that changed how Sarah saw everything. You're teaching me how to think differently, Sarah realized one evening as they floated together in the palace gardens. The unicorn had discovered she could shrink herself down to the size of a small shuttle, which made getting around much easier. Agreement flowed through their connection. The Precursor's technology couldn't be understood through human logic alone. It required a different way of perceiving reality itself. Emperor Vexthor joined them often, sitting quietly and observing. The unicorn had started including him in her lessons, and Sarah could see it was changing him. The stern, proud ruler was softening, becoming more thoughtful. I have spent my entire reign trying to prove Zenthar's greatness, Vexthor admitted one night. I see now that I was seeking glory for its own sake. You're not the only one, Sarah replied. My whole species is like that. We're so busy trying to prove we belong in the galaxy that we forget to just exist in it. The unicorn showed them both a memory, her precursor partner, whose name translated roughly to luminous seeker, sitting on a cliff watching a sunrise. Not studying it, not recording it for science, just appreciating it. The feeling that accompanied the memory was pure contentment. They knew how to simply be, Vexthor said wonderingly. No conquest, no achievement, no purpose beyond experiencing the moment. On the third day, the council reconvened. This time, the meeting was held in the Great Assembly Hall, large enough to accommodate representatives in person rather than through holograms. Sarah stood on the central platform with Vexthor, the unicorn hovering protectively behind them. The hall was packed. Every major civilization had sent their highest officials. Some brought scientists, others brought military advisors, a few brought religious leaders. All of them wanted answers. Ambassador Threx opened the proceedings. We have all had 3 days to consider the situation. The question before the council is simple. What happens to the celestial unicorn? She stays with me, Sarah said immediately. A wave of protest swept through the hall. Unacceptable, shouted the Saurian hegemony representative. One human cannot control access to precursor knowledge. I don't control anything, Sarah replied calmly. She does. I'm just her friend. Unit 7 of the Silicon Concordat projected a holographic display. We have analyzed all available data on the human Sarah Chen. She has no special qualifications, no advanced degrees, no notable achievements prior to this event. There is nothing exceptional about her. Exactly, Sarah agreed, surprising everyone. That's the whole point. The unicorn didn't choose me because I'm exceptional. She chose me because I wasn't trying to be. The Hive World representative buzzed thoughtfully. Explain this paradox. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the unicorn's support flowing through her. Every expert who tried to wake her up came with expectations, with assumptions, with the belief that they already knew what she was and what she should do. They approached her as a problem to solve. I approached her as someone to meet. Semantics, dismissed Ambassador Threx. The result is the same. You have access to knowledge that could benefit all species. Or destroy them, Vexthor interjected. Have any of you considered why the precursors hid this technology? Why they created the unicorn as a guardian, rather than simply leaving their knowledge in databases? That caused some murmuring. It was a good question, one that many had been avoiding. A new voice spoke up from the back of the hall. An elderly krill named Scholar Ven, respected across the galaxy for his wisdom. I have studied the precursors for 700 years. I believe I understand what the human is trying to tell us. The precursors' greatest technology was not their ships or their weapons. It was their philosophy, their way of existing in harmony with the universe itself. And that cannot be taught. It must be learned through experience. Precisely, Sarah said gratefully. The unicorn can't just give you precursor technology, because the technology doesn't work without the understanding that created it. It's like trying to teach calculus to someone who doesn't know basic math. You have to build the foundation first. How long would this learning take? Asked a practical-minded representative from the Trade Federation. Sarah looked at the unicorn, feeling the vastness of what the ship wanted to share. Generations, probably. Maybe longer. The hall erupted in chaos. Generations? Impossible. Unacceptable. They needed results now, not promises of eventual enlightenment. The unicorn suddenly expanded, growing to her full size, filling half the assembly hall. Her hull flashed bright red and everyone fell silent. Sarah felt the ship's frustration and disappointment. These people were exactly like all the others who had tried to use her over the millennia. They wanted shortcuts to power, not genuine understanding. She's leaving, Sarah said quietly, feeling the unicorn's decision. She's going to go dormant again. No. Vexthor stepped forward. Please, give us another chance. The unicorn paused. Sarah felt the ship considering, weighing the Emperor's sincerity against 3,000 years of disappointment. What if we did it differently? Sarah proposed, an idea forming. What if instead of trying to extract knowledge from her, we let her choose students? People from different species who approach learning with humility, rather than entitlement? A school, Scholar Ven said, his eye stalks perking up. A place where species can learn to think as the precursors did. The unicorn's colors shifted to interested yellows and oranges. She was listening. The Academy of Luminous Seeking, Vexthor declared, naming it after the unicorn's lost partner. Here on Xanthar Prime, open to all species, the unicorn will be the headmaster, teaching those who approach with open minds. And who will determine who is worthy to study there? Demanded Ambassador Threck suspiciously. She will, Sarah said, pointing to the unicorn, with no interference from any government or organization. Her judgment alone. This was revolutionary. No single entity had ever been given such authority over galactic affairs. But as the representatives looked at the massive ship, feeling her presence touching their minds, many began to understand. The unicorn was not a tool to be wielded. She was a teacher to be respected. I support this proposal, Scholar Venn said formally. The Krill Collective will send candidates for evaluation. One by one, other representatives added their support. Some grudgingly, others enthusiastically. The military powers were less pleased. But even they couldn't deny that attempting to force the issue would likely result in the unicorn disappearing again. Possibly forever. When the vote was called, the measure passed with a significant majority. The Academy of Luminous Seeking would be established. The celestial unicorn would remain on Xanthar Prime, free to teach as she saw fit. As the assembly hall emptied, Sarah felt a wave of emotion from the unicorn. Relief, gratitude, and something that felt like hope. After 10,000 years, she would finally fulfill her purpose. Vexthor approached Sarah, his scales showing colors of respect and friendship. You have changed the course of galactic history, Sarah Chen. Sarah laughed tiredly. I just wanted to fix a spaceship. This got way more complicated than I expected. Will you stay? Vexthor asked. Help establish the academy? I suspect the unicorn would want you here. Sarah felt the ship's eager agreement. She thought about Earth, about the little apartment she'd left behind, about the normal life she'd never really fit into anyway. Yeah, she said, smiling. I'll stay. Someone has to make sure people remember to actually listen instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. The unicorn chimed her bell-like sound, and both Sarah and Vexthor felt her joy. The long waiting was finally over. The real work was about to begin. 6 months later, the Academy of Luminous Seeking opened its doors. The building was unlike any other structure on Xanthar Prime. The unicorn had helped design it, and it showed. The walls seemed to shift and breathe, adapting to the needs of whoever walked through them. Rooms reconfigured themselves based on the lessons being taught. Gardens grew in impossible spaces, creating places for meditation and reflection. Sarah stood in the main courtyard as the first wave of applicants arrived. Thousands had applied from across the galaxy. The unicorn had selected only 30 for the first class. Sarah had learned not to question her choices, though some of them seemed strange. There was Crix, a young Xanthari noble who had given up his family's wealth to study engineering in the slums. Beside him stood Tala, a human mathematician from a remote colony who saw patterns in chaos theory that no one else could perceive. A krill farmer named Venn Successor, who claimed to be the great-grandson of Scholar Venn. A Silicon Concordate unit who had somehow developed what could only be called curiosity. They're all misfits, Vexthor observed, watching from beside Sarah. None of them are the prestigious scholars or decorated military leaders that their species nominated. She doesn't want people who are already sure they know everything, Sarah replied. She wants people who still know how to wonder. The unicorn descended into the courtyard, shrinking herself to a more manageable size. The students, coming from species that rarely agreed on anything, all had the same expression as they looked at her, awe mixed with a strange sense of recognition, as if they'd been waiting their whole lives for this moment. Sarah stepped forward to address them. Welcome to the Academy. I'm Sarah Chen, and I'll be serving as liaison between you and your teacher. She gestured to the unicorn. Most of you have probably heard stories about what this place will teach. I'm here to tell you that everything you've heard is probably wrong. That got their attention. A Saurian student, a young female named Cess, raised her clawed hand. We were told we would learn precursor technology. Eventually, Sarah agreed. But first, you're going to learn how to learn. You're going to be challenged in ways you can't imagine. You're going to fail, a lot. And most importantly, you're going to learn that the goal isn't to recreate what the precursors did. It's to understand why they did it. The Silicon Concordate Unit, designation Echo 9, projected a question. How long will our studies take? As long as it takes, Sarah answered. This isn't a university where you get a degree in 4 years. This is more like an apprenticeship. You're done when you're done. She could see some of them processing this, uncertainty flickering across various faces and communication devices. Good. Uncertainty meant they were really thinking. The unicorn chimed softly and began to glow. Sarah felt the familiar brush of consciousness as the ship reached out to each student individually. She was introducing herself, letting them feel her presence, establishing the connection that would be crucial to their learning. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched the first class adapt to the Academy's unusual teaching methods. The unicorn didn't lecture. She didn't provide textbooks or structured lessons. Instead, she presented experiences. One day, she took the entire class into orbit and showed them a star being born. Not through screens or sensors, but by somehow letting them perceive it directly, feeling the fusion of hydrogen, the dance of gravity and energy. Students emerged from the experience changed, seeing physics not as equations but as music. Another time, she shrank herself and the students down to molecular size and let them experience matter from the inside. Crix, the Xanthari noble, spent 3 days in meditation afterward trying to process what he'd learned about the nature of reality. Sarah's role evolved into something unexpected. She became the grounding force, the one who helped students process their experiences and integrate them into their existing understanding. She'd sit with them in the gardens drinking coffee while they tried to put the ineffable into words. I don't understand, Tala confessed one evening. The unicorn showed me how the precursors could fold space. But when I try to explain it mathematically, the equations don't work. Maybe you're using the wrong math, Sarah suggested. There's no such thing as wrong math. Math is universal, Sarah smiled. Is it? Or is that just what we assume because it's always worked before? What if the precursors discovered that the universe uses math we haven't invented yet? Tala stared at her and Sarah could see the moment when the idea clicked. The human mathematician ran off, already scribbling equations on her datapad, approaching mathematics from an entirely new direction. Not all the students adapted well. 3 left within the first month, frustrated by the lack of concrete answers. The unicorn let them go without judgment, and Sarah noticed that she seemed almost pleased. Those who left weren't ready, and that was fine. Readiness couldn't be forced. The success stories were remarkable, though. Echo 9, the curious Silicon Concordate unit, had started developing something unprecedented: intuition. Digital minds weren't supposed to have gut feelings or hunches, but Echo was learning to trust impressions that couldn't be quantified. The Concordate was baffled. Echo was delighted. Cess, the young Saurian, had always been gifted with empathy unusual for her species. Under the unicorn's guidance, she was learning to extend that empathy beyond living things to the universe itself. She could sense stellar currents and gravitational flows like a sailor feeling the wind. Other students had started coming to her when they needed help understanding cosmic phenomena, because she could feel what the equations meant. Vexthor visited the academy regularly, often sitting in on lessons when his duties allowed. Sarah noticed he was changing too. The emperor, who had once defined success by conquest and glory, now spent hours in the meditation gardens, simply existing in harmony with the world around him. I wasted so much time, he told Sarah one day, centuries pursuing the unicorn as a trophy. If I had only approached her the way you did, we could have been learning all along. Maybe you weren't ready, Sarah said gently. Maybe your empire needed those centuries to develop before they could appreciate what she had to offer. Maybe everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. Vexthor considered this. That is very human thinking. My people prefer to believe we control our destinies. And look where that got you. 3,000 years staring at a dormant ship. The Emperor's scales rippled with amusement. You have become quite bold. Sarah Chen. I learned from the best, she replied, nodding toward the unicorn, who was currently teaching a group of students to perceive quantum states through direct observation, rather than mathematical description. As the first year of the academy drew to a close, something unexpected happened. The students who had been learning separately, each developing their own unique understanding, spontaneously began collaborating. Crix's newfound understanding of matter interfaced with Tala's new mathematics. Cess's empathic perception combined with Echo 9's intuitive processing. They weren't just learning as individuals, they were learning as a collective. The unicorn showed Sarah a memory, and suddenly she understood. This was how the precursors had worked. Not as isolated geniuses, but as a symphony of different perspectives, each contributing their unique understanding to create something greater than any individual could achieve. She's not just teaching them precursor knowledge, Sarah realized. She's teaching them to become like the precursors themselves. Vexthor had joined her observation. Is that wise? The precursors destroyed themselves through conflict. They destroyed themselves because some of them forgot how to collaborate, Sarah corrected. These students are learning collaboration from the beginning. They're building something the precursors never quite achieved, unity through diversity. The unicorn chimed in agreement, her hull showing brilliant golds and whites. This was what she had hoped for, what her lost partner Luminous Seeker had dreamed of before the end, a new generation that could learn from the precursors' mistakes while building on their wisdom. As Sarah watched the students work together, solving problems that would have baffled the greatest scientists in the galaxy, just a year ago, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was bigger than fixing a ship. This was fixing the future, and it had all started with a simple choice: to treat someone with respect rather than ambition, to listen rather than demand, to offer friendship instead of seeking power. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the most revolutionary act is simply being kind. 3 years into the Academy's operation, the first crisis emerged. It came not from outside but from within the students themselves. They had learned so much, grown so far beyond what their original species considered possible, that they no longer fit in their old worlds. Crix tried to return to Zenthar's high society for a diplomatic function and found himself unable to participate in the shallow displays of wealth and power. He left halfway through, apologizing to his family in a letter that tried to explain concepts they couldn't grasp. Tala published a paper on her new mathematical framework and was laughed out of academic circles. Other human mathematicians called her work mystical, nonsense, and abandoning rigorous proof for feelings. She came back to the Academy in tears. Echo 9 was forcibly disconnected from the Silicon Concordat network after attempting to share what they had learned. The Concordat declared Echo's new intuitive processes to be a malfunction and demanded the unit return for reprogramming. Sarah found Cess sitting alone in one of the gardens, her scales dull with sadness. My clutchmates say I've been corrupted, the Saurian explained. They say I've forgotten what it means to be Saurian. Maybe they're right. Have you? Sarah asked gently. I don't know anymore. I can feel the pain of stars dying light years away. I can sense the joy of newborn planets. But I can't enjoy the hunt anymore. I can't find pride in dominating weaker creatures. What am I if I'm not Saurian? This was the conversation Sarah had been dreading. She'd seen it coming, felt the students pulling away from their origins, transforming into something new. She'd brought her concerns to the unicorn, but the ship had remained enigmatically calm. I need to speak to everyone, Sarah decided. All the students together. That evening, she gathered the entire academy in the main hall. 30 students representing 15 different species, all of them struggling with the same fundamental crisis of identity. I know what you're all feeling, Sarah began. You've changed so much that you don't recognize yourselves anymore. You look at your species and see limitations you once called strengths. You think things your people would call impossible or insane. You're wondering if the cost of learning was too high. Heads nodded across the assembled group. Even Echo 9's lights flickered in agreement. I'm going to tell you something that might make this worse before it makes it better, Sarah continued. You're right. You have changed. You can't go back to who you were. The knowledge you carry, the perspective you've gained, it's permanent. You're not really Zenthari or human or Saurian or Krill anymore. The hall fell silent. This was their deepest fear spoken aloud. But here's what you also need to understand. You're not alone. Look around you. Every person in this room is going through the same transformation. You're not losing your identity. You're finding a new one together. Tala spoke up, her voice shaking. What are we becoming? Before Sarah could answer, the unicorn descended into the hall, growing to fill the space. Her hull pulsed with colors Sarah had never seen before, and suddenly everyone's mind was flooded with a vision. They saw the precursors, not as they had been taught to imagine them, but as they truly were. The precursors hadn't been a single species. They were dozens of species who had learned to transcend their biological limitations while honoring their origins. A precursor could be anything or anyone, united not by genetics but by philosophy. The unicorn showed them Luminous Seeker's memories. She had been born something like a Xanthari, with scales and multiple eyes. But by the time she partnered with the unicorn, she had grown beyond simple biology. She was still herself, still carried the essence of what she had been, but had expanded to encompass so much more. The vision shifted, showing what the precursors had dreamed of before their fall. A galaxy filled with beings from every species who had learned to grow beyond their limitations while celebrating their diversity. Not homogenization, but harmonization. Each voice unique, all singing the same song. When the vision faded, Sarah saw understanding dawning on the students' faces. "We're becoming the next precursors," Crick said wonderingly. "No," Sarah corrected gently. "You're becoming the first of something new. The precursors failed because they couldn't agree on how to handle their power. You have the chance to do better because you're learning together from the start." Echo 9 projected a hologram of all 30 students, their different biologies and backgrounds creating a complex pattern. "We are a proof of concept. If we can unite despite our differences, others can learn the same." "But our people don't understand," Cess protested. "They think we've been corrupted or gone mad. How do we bridge that gap?" Vexthor entered the hall, and Sarah was startled to see several other figures with him. Scholar Venn, now elderly even by Krill standards, a Silicon Concordat administrator, a high-ranking Saurian military officer, representatives from a dozen other major species. "By showing them," Vexthor said, "these witnesses have come to see what the Academy has achieved. They are the open-minded leaders of their species, those willing to consider that perhaps the old ways are not the only ways." Scholar Venn stepped forward, his eye stalks dim with age but bright with curiosity. "I have lived 700 years, and in that time I have seen empires rise and fall, technologies advance and stagnate. But I have never seen anything like what you students represent. You are not corrupted. You are evolved." The Saurian officer, a scarred veteran named General Rax, spoke next. "I came here expecting to find soldiers who had been weakened by philosophy. Instead, I see warriors who have learned to fight battles I never imagined. Cess, your people do not understand you now, but they will. I will make certain of it." One by one, the visiting leaders spoke. Not all were convinced, but all were intrigued. They saw the potential in what the students were becoming, even if they didn't fully understand it. The Silicon Concordat administrator, a unit designated Prime 7, approached Echo 9. "The Concordat was wrong to declare you malfunctioning. Your development represents the next stage of our evolution. Will you help us understand?" Echo 9's lights pulsed with emotion. "Only if you approach as a student, not as an administrator seeking to control the process." "Agreed," Prime 7 replied, and there was something new in the synthetic voice. Humility. Sarah felt the unicorn's approval flowing through her mind. This was the bridge they needed. The students couldn't return to their old worlds, but they could help their worlds come to them. "I propose an expansion of the Academy," Vexthor announced. "Not just for students, but for observation and exchange. Let the leaders of the galaxy come here, not to learn precursor technology, but to witness what learning can create. Let them see that evolution is not betrayal of one species, but celebration of what one species can become." The unicorn chimed her agreement, and Sarah saw the plan forming. The Academy would become not just a school, but a demonstration, proof that the galaxy could grow beyond its current limitations. "We'll need more teachers," Sarah said, looking at the 30 students. "Are you ready for that responsibility?" Crick straightened, his scales showing determination. "We've been taught by the best teacher in existence. We owe it to others to share what we've learned. But we share it the right way," Tala added, "not by demanding change, but by offering possibility." "We become living examples," Cess agreed, "showing our people what they could be without forcing them to change." The vote was unanimous. The students would stay at the Academy, but they would also serve as ambassadors to their species, bridges between the old ways and the new possibilities. As the meeting dispersed and students began planning their new roles, Sarah found herself alone with the unicorn in the gardens. The massive ship had shrunk down to human size, floating beside her like a companion. "You knew this would happen," Sarah said. "You knew they'd face rejection and crisis." Agreement flowed through their bond. The unicorn had seen it happen before with the precursors. The difference was that this time, She could guide the students through the crisis instead of watching helplessly as civilizations tore themselves apart over philosophical differences. "Thank you for trusting me," Sarah said softly. "I'm still just a mechanic from Earth. Sometimes I feel like I'm in way over my head." The unicorn showed her a memory. That first night 3 years ago, when Sarah had sat on the floor of the Hall of Forgotten Wonders and simply talked to a sleeping ship. No expectations, no demands, just honest conversation from someone who saw a person instead of a tool. That moment had changed everything. Not because Sarah was exceptional, but because she had been willing to be ordinary in the right way. She had approached with humility, curiosity, and respect, and that had made all the difference. As Sarah sat in the garden with her impossible friend, watching students plan a future that would reshape the galaxy, she understood something profound. The greatest changes don't come from the greatest people. They come from ordinary people who choose moment by moment to do the right thing in the right way. And sometimes the right thing is as simple as treating someone with kindness. 20 years had passed since Sarah Chen first walked into the Hall of Forgotten Wonders. The Academy of Luminous Seeking had grown from 30 students to 300, with satellite campuses on 12 different worlds. The original students were now masters in their own right, teaching the next generation while continuing their own journey of discovery. Sarah stood on the observation deck of the Zenthar Prime campus, her hair now streaked with gray, watching a group of young students experience their first perception expansion. The unicorn was showing them the birth of a galaxy, and their minds were struggling to comprehend the timescales involved. She remembered her own first experience with cosmic time and smiled at their reactions. "You look satisfied," Vexthor said, joining her on the deck. The Emperor had aged as well, his scales showing patterns of silver that marked long life among his people. "I'm thinking about how far we've come," Sarah replied. "When I arrived, you had a dead ship and a dying dream. Now look at us." Below them, the students began to emerge from their shared vision, laughing and crying and trying to explain to each other what they'd experienced. That moment of collective understanding was what the Academy was all about. The Galactic Council has formally requested that Academy graduates serve as mediators in the Threshold conflict, Vexthor said. "Both sides trust them in ways they don't trust anyone else." Sarah nodded. The Threshold conflict had been brewing for years between the expansionist Forge Alliance and the preservationist Garden Worlds. Traditional diplomacy had failed because neither side could understand the other's perspective. But Academy graduates who had learned to hold multiple viewpoints simultaneously could bridge that gap. "Cess is already there," Sarah said. "She says both sides are so used to seeing the universe in binary terms that they can't imagine a third option exists. She's trying to show them that growth and preservation aren't opposites, they're partners. Will she succeed? The unicorn thinks so, and I've learned to trust her judgment." As if summoned by her name, the unicorn descended to the observation deck. She had changed over the years too, though not in ways easily defined. She seemed more present somehow, more engaged with the physical world. Sarah suspected it was because she was no longer alone. She had students, colleagues, friends. The ship projected an image into their minds, a vision of the galaxy 20 years from now, 50 years, 100. She showed them Academy graduates reaching positions of influence across every major civilization. Not through conquest or manipulation, but through genuine wisdom. She showed conflicts resolved through understanding rather than force. She showed technology advancing not for its own sake but in harmony with philosophy. It was the future the precursors had dreamed of but never achieved. "There's something else," Vexthor said carefully. "The Council has received signals from beyond our galaxy. Another civilization, vastly different from anything we know, is attempting to make contact. They've requested that the Academy coordinate first contact." Sarah felt a thrill of excitement mixed with trepidation. Humanity had been the youngest species in the known galaxy. Now they were facing something potentially even more alien. "What does the unicorn think?" Sarah asked. The ship's colors shifted to thoughtful purples and blues. She showed them a memory of the precursors encountering new life for the first time, the joy and wonder of discovering minds that thought in entirely different patterns. Then she showed the later memories, the fear and conflict that arose when those differences became threatening rather than fascinating. "She's saying the Academy needs to be ready," Sarah interpreted. "First contact isn't just about communication. It's about approaching the unknown with the right mindset, which is why she wants you to lead the contact team." Vexthor revealed. Sarah laughed. Me, I'm not a diplomat or a scientist. I'm just a mechanic who got lucky. The unicorn chimed softly, and Sarah felt a wave of affectionate disagreement. She wasn't just a mechanic. She was the person who had approached an impossible situation with humility and curiosity. She was the one who had started a revolution by simply being willing to listen. Fine, Sarah sighed. But I'm taking Crix, Tala, Echo 9, and Cess with me. If we're doing this, we're doing it the Academy way. Over the following months, preparations were made. The contact team studied everything known about the incoming signals, trying to understand the mindset behind them. The aliens, who called themselves something that translated roughly to Weavers, communicated in patterns of light and sound that suggested a fundamentally different relationship with reality. They don't separate observer from observed, Tala explained excitedly. Their physics is based on the assumption that consciousness affects reality at a fundamental level. It's like quantum mechanics taken to its ultimate conclusion. How do we even begin to communicate with minds that different? Crix wondered. The same way Sarah communicated with the unicorn, Echo 9 suggested. Not by imposing our framework on them, but by being open to theirs. When the Weaver vessel finally arrived at the designated neutral zone, the Academy team was ready. The unicorn accompanied them, along with a small fleet of observers from various species. Everyone in the galaxy was watching this moment. The Weaver ship was unlike anything in known space. It seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, its structure shifting based on who was observing it. Sarah's human eyes saw something like a crystalline flower. Crix's Xanthari senses perceived it as a living nebula. Echo 9's digital sensors registered it as pure information, given physical form. Sarah took a deep breath and initiated contact. Hello. We are students of the precursors seeking to learn from those who think differently than we do. We come not to conquer or convert, but to understand and be understood. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the Weaver ship responded, not with words but with a cascade of sensations. Curiosity, caution, and underneath it all, a question that resonated through everyone's mind. Are you real or are we dreaming you? Sarah smiled. It was so alien, so different from any greeting she'd ever imagined, and yet it was perfect. The Weaver's entire philosophy was right there in that question. They experienced reality as a shared dream, where consciousness and existence were inseparable. Maybe both, Sarah answered. Maybe we're all dreaming each other into existence. Does it matter? The Weaver ship pulsed with what felt like delight. The Academy team had passed some kind of test by not insisting on objective reality, by being willing to meet the Weavers in their conceptual space. Contact proceeded slowly, carefully, with both sides learning to translate not just language but entire ways of thinking. The Academy team found that their training prepared them perfectly for this challenge. They had learned to hold multiple perspectives, to see reality through different lenses, to accept that their way wasn't the only way. Months later, when the first exchange program was established between the Academy and the Weavers, Sarah realized something profound. The precursors had tried to spread their knowledge through technology. The Academy was spreading it through philosophy. Technology could be stolen or misused, but a way of thinking, once truly understood, became part of who you were. On the day the Weaver students arrived at the Academy, Sarah stood with Vexthor and the unicorn, watching different species from two galaxies begin to learn together. My ancestor would be astounded, Vexthor said. When he found the unicorn, he thought it was a weapon or a tool. He never imagined it was a teacher that would reshape civilizations. What do you imagine now? Sarah asked. Vexthor considered this, his scales showing the deep golds of contentment. I imagine a galaxy where power is measured not by what you can take, but by what you can understand. Where strength comes from wisdom rather than force. Where the greatest achievement is not dominance but harmony. That's very precursor of you, Sarah teased gently. Perhaps, Vexthor agreed. Or perhaps it's simply what any civilization learns when they finally stop trying to conquer the universe and start trying to understand it. The unicorn chimed softly. Her hull showing colors that Sarah had learned meant deep satisfaction. Her journey, which had begun 10,000 years ago with luminous Seeker's dream, was finally bearing fruit. Not through force or revelation, but through patience and the gradual transformation of hearts and minds. Sarah thought about that first night when she'd sat on the cold floor and talked to a sleeping ship. She'd had no grand ambitions, no master plan. She'd just been herself, treating another being with the respect and kindness she'd want for herself. And from that simple act of decency, a revolution had grown. As she watched students from across 2 galaxies begin their studies together, learning to see through each other's eyes and think with each other's minds, Sarah understood what the precursors had really left behind. Not technology or power, but a question. What could the universe become if everyone approached it with wisdom rather than ambition, with curiosity rather than fear, with kindness rather than greed? The Academy of Luminous Seeking was finding out, one student at a time. And somewhere in the depths of space, in the quantum foam where possibilities became realities, Sarah felt the precursors watching. Not as ghosts or gods, but as the philosophical foundation upon which a new civilization was being built. They hadn't died. They had transformed, Elle.